Happy Earth Day, everybody. My name is Michelle Icestone, and I am a horticulture professor down in the horticulture unit. Additionally, I am the Hort Club advisor. I'm here today to talk to you about composting. Composting is great for carbon sequestration. It's great for feeding soil microbes. It's great for water holding capacity of soil, and it's also great for soil amending. So these would be all the reasons to compost. So today we're going to put together a compost pile. I'm going to talk specifically about the arrangement of material in a compost pile, how to build a compost pile, and then lastly, how to keep it aerated and moist. So when building a compost pile, you need a ratio of 3:1 brown to green. So thicker layers of carbon material to your green material. Where would you want to have your compost pile? I know we're looking at a sunny spot right now, but this is basically early on in the day. This afternoon, this spot where we're going to have our compost pile is in the shade for most of the day. And you also want to keep it moist. You'll notice as we're building the compost pile, we're going to be basically moistening the layers as we go. The compost pile needs air and it needs moisture on top of your carbon and your green. So you've probably heard about composting that you need to have what we call a brown to green ratio. And so what that green is and what that brown is, it really depends. So brown could be simply brown leaves, okay? Brown could also be shredded up cardboard, it could be shredded up newspaper, so carbon material. And the green could be lawn clippings, but make sure that they're not sprayed with any poisons and make sure that they aren't being used with any kind of chemical fertilizers. Other things that are great, legumes. So I pulled a piece of vetch here. This is a common weed of the time right now. And what's great about legumes is, again, they have nitrogen fixing capabilities. So here on the roots, I have the nitrogen fixing nodules that show you that I have this bacteria here on this plant. So legumes are great for this. Other materials. Green materials are also manure. So chicken manure is great for this. Steer manure is great for this. Horse manure is great for this. Also, coffee grounds, great, basically green material. And so the way I like to think about it when we're building a compost pile is this. We're building a fire, essentially. And that's exactly what we're doing. So for the most part, you wouldn't build a fire with a big log, right? You would basically start with small branches and paper and stuff like that, so you could build your embers. Then you'd add your log. Same kind of rules apply here. We are going to use the green material. This kind of ignites the pile versus the carbon material, which basically makes it slow burn, which keeps it burning. And so what happens in a compost pile is that we have these great little bacteria called actinomycetes. And those guys basically start breeding and eating up the material in your compost pile. And then from there, the compost pile gets so hot that basically all those guys burn out. And that's the point in which you need to turn your pile and get it nice and aerated again so that you can build up that population of actinomycetes again. So you have this whole building of your compost pile and taking it down, and building it up and taking it down. And if you are good at aerating your pile, you'll have compost in 3 weeks. So typically, a compost pile is usually about 3 feet by 3 feet. It can be as tall as 6 feet, but you have to remember, as the shepherd of the pile, what can you physically do? The average homeowner can easily turn a 3 by 3 pile, but the taller you get, the harder it is for the average homeowner to turn a pile. But it could be as tall as 6 feet. As you're looking at our pile, you'll see that we've gone a little wider than 3 feet, but we are at least about 3 feet tall. So things that I always do. On top of the pile, basically I always put a layer of straw. And that's not necessarily to break down, that's really to help hold moisture in the pile. Remember always with compost, it's air and it's moisture. If you're missing one of those components, you are not going to basically you're not going to be making compost anytime soon. And if you don't turn your pile, we're banking on aerobic bacteria. If you don't turn your pile will get broken down by anaerobes. And anaerobes are basically not nearly as desirable, especially for making nutrients accessible to plant roots, as aerobes are. So again, we want to make sure that you are turning your pile and basically you're keeping it moist. You might have noticed as we were building the pile, we were moistening the layers as we were building the pile. That's the best way to go. If you build your pile with dry material and think that you're gonna get your whole pile wet by just watering the top, you're not. And when you turn your pile, you should also be re-moistening it then too. So there's multiple ways to turn a pile. I think the easiest way is to take the straw off and basically pull the pile out flat. You can also basically just kind of turn it, from one side of an area to another. It really depends on the space that you have. But again, the important part is keeping your pile aerated. So lastly, I want to talk about receptacles for compost. I think composting is beautiful because number one, we're recycling materials, we're making sure it's not getting into the landfill, and we're creating something that's going to be so good for your soil. But not everybody feels that way, and I understand that. So there are many items that you can purchase for compost making. Most notably are the turning ones. I mean, multiple people have seen the ones where you have a hand crank and it turns your pile for you. Thing I will caution you about that is that sometimes your pile gets pretty heavy because you've got lots of material and it's moist, and so I've known of many big strong people that basically that find that those turning compost guys that with a hand crank are actually kind of hard to move. We actually are using these U-line boxes. Like ultimately this pile that we've built will go into these nice U-line boxes. These are not terribly expensive, and as you can see, we put holes all the way down the front. We put holes basically on the top, and if you look actually in the box, you'll see that there's holes all through the bottom. Okay, is this enough to aerate your pile? No. Remember that basically the oxygen to your pile is always the best at the boundary between your pile and air. But the problem is the center of your pile, so you're still going to have to turn it. Okay. There are other quick little setups that you can do. There's a pallet setup that I'm going to show you that was our original composting place. However, the pallets basically break down really fast, so I will show you what that looks like next. But in general, you just need to make sure that you have air all throughout the pile. And so, for the most part, having a box like this where you have holes across the front, holes in the bottom, and holes on the roof is basically your best situation. These are not terribly ugly. They just fit into your yard nicely. We went through and hit this up with some linseed oil just to kind of preserve the wood so that they would hopefully last longer. But in general, the rules of thumb on composting receptacles is you've got to have a lot of holes because you have to have a good access to air. The pallet box for composting. So that's basically taking multiple pallets together and putting together in a framework, having a hinged door and having a hinged lid. Additionally, you have hardware wire, and that's mostly to keep rodents out. I think I've neglected to say in all of this is basically when you're using kitchen scraps, basically remember that if you have rodents in the neighborhood, every rodent loves a compost pile, and I know that is a major turnoff. As long as basically you have it so that it's covered so rodents can't get in, you're fine. If you just have a pile, rodents are pretty much going to leave it alone. It's when you start doing stuff fancy. There are other ways that you can add air into a pile so that you don't have to turn it. You could use perforated large pipe, which you put underneath your pile and or drive down the center of your pile, and you can get oxygen in the center of your pile then. However, it's nice and warm and it's a great place for rodents to live. So these are really the only real problems with composting that you have to be aware of. If you're going to leave your compost pile and you're not going to turn it, you're going to have rats in it probably, especially if you're going to use food material, food scraps. However, if you're turning your pile and you're keeping it moist, or you've got it in some kind of receptacle covered, then you're not going to have any problems with rodents at all. So guys, that concludes our compost presentation for the day. I hope I basically gave you some nice tips for doing compost at your house. There are other composting methods that hopefully in further videos we will address, like vermicompost, so that's worm compost. But that's not for today, that's for the next video, so stay tuned.